Good day, folks, and welcome to the Anorak Review Show with your host, the Anorak. Well, right now I'm feeling a bit of the post-summer blues right now at the moment, so I guess I could perk up myself a bit by listening to an old rock and roll record. And of course, it's yet another Pink Floyd record. So far I've covered Meddle, Obscured by Clouds, and Animals. So this time, I wish to cover a particular album of theirs. The first one to not feature the bassist himself, Roger Waters. Long story short, after the final cut in 1983, Roger apparently wanted to dissolve the band for good, believing it to be, in his own words, a spent force creatively. But he, along with guitarist David Gilmour and drummer Nick Mason, this was back when keyboardist Richard Wright was temporarily off the band since mid-production of The Wall back in 1979, discovered that by not producing any more Floyd albums, the band as a collective whole would find themselves under a breach of contract, and their royalty payments would be put under suspension. I guess that's what likely happens if you ever signed up with a big corporate company. And so, by 1985, Roger reached out to EMI and Columbia Records, stating that he had resigned from the band and wished to be relieved of any and all obligations. This seemingly meant that Nick and David could carry on by themselves as Pink Floyd. However, upon learning of this, Roger supposedly threatened legal action and demanded that the Pink Floyd name may never be used again. And even when sessions for the next album had already begun by late 1986, not to mention all the legal issues regarding bringing back Richard as a full-on member again. And only well after the album had already been released in September 87 would all the disputes be resolved in or out of court. I could go into much further detail into this, but I don't wish to take too long, and one could easily make a whole video about all this whole long ago debacle. Right now though, let's just jump into Pink Floyd's 1987 album, A Momentary Lapse of Reason. The cover itself is fairly decent, once again done by the mind of Storm Thorgerson. After the dissolvement of Hypnosis back in 1983, we see what seems to be an endless array of beds, apparently like 700 or 800 of them. This was shot in the Sawton Sands in North Devon, where, funny enough, the World War II flashbacks from the Wall film were also filmed in. You could also see a little hand glider there, far in the back, as well as a few dogs on the side, obviously alluding to a couple of songs in the album. And like any good Pink Floyd album, it's a gatefold. Can't go wrong with that, eh? But anyways, let's just get into the music. Let's dive into the music itself, shall we? Our album begins with Signs of Life, an ambient instrumental piece that starts off with what sounds like the creaky and squeaking rowing of oars on a river. Bob Ezrin, the producer of this album, who also co-produced The Wall, and as well as several albums by Alice Cooper, Deep Purple, and many other bands and musicians, actually recorded someone rowing down the River Thames, which is also the general location of the Astoria, the houseboat that David used as a recording studio for a good chunk of this album, as well as the Division Bell and the Endless River, and his later solo albums On an Island and Rattle That Lock. Then we get some low and eerie, almost alien-like synthesizers played by the contributions of David and Richard, as well as Bob Ezrin and John Caron. It makes me think of like a foggy, misty day or morning in Grantchester Meadows, as strange, otherworldly life forms just roam about and explore the whole area, hovering over the river and everything. Then partway into it, we hear what seemed to be a poem of sorts being spoken by none other than Nick himself. Possibly the first time he ever did any vocal contributions in a Pink Floyd song since One of These Days, from Meddle all the way back in 1971. just 16 years prior. Now, the first many times I listened to it, I could never really decipher and understand what was actually being said in it, possibly due to it being sort of in and out in the mix. However, other people have apparently made it out much better than I ever could, as it apparently said, "When the childlike view of the world went, nothing replaced it. I don't like being asked to. Other people replaced it. Someone who knows." What this could actually mean exactly is, of course, up for interpretation. Some may have said that this could be about both Syd Barrett and Roger Waters, the former members of Pink Floyd at the time, which seems pretty likely. The very title itself could very well refer to this sense of hope, faith, and persistence that both David, Nick, and even Richard may have had at the time in continuing on, even if without Roger, the same way Pink Floyd had to carry on without Syd Barrett. Then the mood changes to something slightly more fittingly uplifting as a familiar sounding guitar comes into play for a while before it all fades out. This whole track definitely reminds me quite a lot of the first part of Shine On Your Crazy Diamond from Wish You Were Here, which too is very much fitting. It's then followed up by Learning to Fly. Not to be confused with the Tom Petty song of the same name, which came out about 4 years later, and is also pretty just as good as well, really. This is what I would like to call progressive pop rock, if that makes any sense. It has some of the instrumentations and musical complexities like a few of their other classics, while having a bit of an accessible edge for easy listeners. This song may most likely represent David's interest in piloting, as well as taking on a new change in life and facing new challenges ahead, such as being the new lead of Pink Floyd, a sense of release and freedom. And in a way, this could easily be interpreted as being about Pink, the main character from The Wall, actually starting to reach out and open up a bit after several years of social isolation and alienation and having his own wall torn down. Maybe the final cut showed his slow but gradual transition back into sanity as he starts to view the world around him proper. He can't keep his eyes from the circling skies, tongue-tied and twisted. He's just an earthbound misfit. Seems more or less that David had found himself in the world of the Earthbound game. That or the Misfits TV series. Does anyone remember that? I don't know. Also, you may notice that the chorus begins with can't and begins with I, possibly to rhyme with the circling sky bit. I don't know if there's a word or term used to refer to this, taking what would be the first word of a sentence from the beginning and putting it at the end of it instead, but it does seem interesting. Anyways, the flight aspect is further emphasized by the middle part, where we hear what sounds like pilots speaking, one of them being Nick, of course, and mentioning all the little setups and details when preparing the airplane for takeoff. Like with Signs of Life, you could make out some of it, but it's all sandwiched in the overall musical mix. Then David's echoey voice returns as we soar through the skies, and there's even a bit of a callback to Comfortably Numb with the line, "out of the corner of my watery eye." Before we have one last bit of that beautifully epic chorus and an underrated guitar solo to go out on. In fact, one of the backing vocals for this and most of the tracks in this album is Carmen Twilly, who would go on to sing lead vocals for the song Circle of Life in Disney's 1994 animated feature, The Lion King. Oh yes, that Circle of Life. I'm not kidding at all one bit. Look it up for yourselves. Then the mood changes from bright to dark with the Dogs of War, with what sounds like low plane engines running, or even dog growls, fitting either way. Then we hear what sound like deep, grungy strings like a cello or double bass, along with some booms like distant bombs exploding, already setting up the grim and warlike tone of this track. And accompanied by a semi-gothic organ, David belts out about the dogs of war, the titular dogs of war, and how, with no cause, they don't discriminate. Flesh and bone is their currency. Must be a really bad recession today for the economy to take a dark turn like this. One world, it's a battleground, and they'll smash it down. Turns out the Dogs of War are actually avid fans of that PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds game. And as you might imagine, the themes expand and continue off the likes of the wall, money, Uzzendom, and animals, once again using dogs as a metaphor for the predatory and ruthless nature of certain businessmen and politicians who would rather lie, deceive, and sought after wars and conflicts as a means of maintaining wealth and power, or even gaining more so, even if at the cost of both soldiers and innocent lives lost in the crossfires alike. And after another verse and chorus, we get not one, but two solos. The first being a very gritty, bluesy guitar solo from the Dave man himself at the 3-minute mark that goes on for like nearly a minute before the other solo, a thrilling, chilling, marching saxophone solo from Scott Page, who also worked with other bands like Toto and Supertramp, and founding Blues Brothers member Tom Scott, who had also worked with so many artists for me to even count. I can easily imagine those famous marching hammers from the wall marching along to this beat. The intense, brutal music and its militaristic lyrical content definitely remind me a bit of The Wall, specifically in The Flesh, Run Like Hell, and Waiting for the Worms. Perhaps after flying back home and learning to fly, Pink reflects on how he had hallucinated about being a neo-Nazi leader back in The Wall, and now he sees similar evils around him, realizing that many people in the world are in some ways like him. No matter what he may change, the dogs still remain. And even when he knows so, or at least that's how I imagined it. But aside from that, this is a very decent track. So to any naysayers who may say that David isn't as good as making good old rocking songs like Roger is, I may point to you to examples like this to prove otherwise. Things then calm down a bit as we say quite seamlessly into One Slip, where we hear what sound like someone playing an old game of Pong or Atari. Then suddenly, it goes off like an alarm clock, not unlike Time from Darkside. Apparently, it's actually the alarm sound of the security system in one of the recording studios they were using. And like with Time, it then goes into this kind of drum-like rhythm, more similar to Living on the Ceiling by Blank Marge. That, or the soundtrack to Disney's Tarzan. Boy, imagine if David, Nick, and Richard, as Pink Floyd, did the music for that film. Or any Disney film for that matter. That would be interesting. Aside from that, the guitar that enters in and the overall build-up here does again remind me of the start of Run Like Hell. The track seems to concern the growing and straining relationships that may come within romances and stuff, no matter how short or long they may be. As David sings about being on the road to ruin, whirling around without an end, with no hint or word, only her honor to defend. And she'll bring honor to us all. She says, or rather sighs, I will, to David's request, possibly a vow at a wedding perhaps. Then she tosses her mane while his resolve is put to the test. Basically, they were unable to afford an actual flower bouquet to throw over the bride's shoulder, so they just had to settle for her fake line-made wig. Then in the chorus, they have one slip, and they fall down the hole. And this is what happens when you go ice skating recklessly on thin ice. Or as Roger Waters would put it, the thin ice of modern life. Then one of the lines David sings is, "A momentary lapse of reason," which is where the title of the album itself came from, as if to say that this is the core song of the album. Whether that is so or not is, again, up for debate. But it does mean a moment of hesitation while someone tries to think of a good valid reason, as if David is questioning himself why he's even in this relationship to begin with. And after a good and suspenseful instrumental middle section of rumbling drum rolls and heavenly synth chords, we get another verse where David questions himself, wondering whether it was love or just the idea of being in love, or the hand of fate that fits it like glove. So Torgo and the master from Manners to Hands of Fate are behind all this all along. Should have known. But as the moments slip by and the seeds are sown, our couple are uncertain of each other, yet neither wish to be alone and apart from each other. Which I think could sum up a lot of marriages nowadays in a single nutshell. Side 1 ends with On the Turning Away, an arena rock ballad that deals with homelessness, poverty, and the apathy expressed towards such, not unlike Man on the Corner by Genesis or Another Day in Paradise by Phil Collins. As a low synth chord rises from the dead of silence just before David's voice comes in with a reverb effect behind it, giving it a very vast yet isolated feel, made more so by how he sings about the pale and downtrodden, a case of all the suffering, and how we're all joining in the turning away. Then we hear that familiar acoustic guitar, very reminiscent of the title song from Wish You Were Here, as David goes on to mention the growing ranks driven by a heart of stone, or should I say, dragged down by the stone. Then, at over 2 minutes in, we get not only a kind of sort of guitar solo, but we could hear a bit of that familiar and distinct Hammond organ from Richard here and there, before it all soon crashes down, a bit like Hey You from The Wall, as we hear that organ chord and a faint resolving melodic bass line from Tony Levin, who did most, if not all, of the bass in this album, with the absence of Roger Waters. As much as I prefer Roger and his bass skills, Tony does his best as a substitute here, even if he's not considered a true Pink Floyd member. Then, in a very heart-lifting climax, David, along with some backing vocals, as if in an act of unity, stand up and sing together, demanding no more turning away from the weak, the weary, and the coldness inside, a world that we all must share and strive for. Feels, man. So much feels. I interpreted this song as having Pink return home and seeing all the disarray and the poverty around him, coming to terms with what had happened with the rest of the world ever since he initially isolated himself within his wall. And now he wishes to help those in need, those who had been isolated and alienated like he was. And no doubt doing a Live Aid concert as well as a result. I mean, being a rock star and all, he must still have a lot of money to give charity to. And of course, what better way for a Pink Floyd song to go out on than with a classically progging guitar solo going on for the last 2+ minutes of the song before fading down and out. Even if its message may seem a bit preachy to some, even you can't deny it's such emotional music and a good track to end the first half of the album on.